A tourist boldly crosses the line, challenging the guard. The crowd holds its breath, watching as tensions rise. What happens next isn't just justice. It's a lesson no one will forget. But what comes after will shock you. Let's start from the beginning. In the heart of Chicago, Officer Derek Hayes stood at the corner of a bustling street, towering over the flow of people like a sentinel. The usual chaos of the city felt charged today, as if the air itself crackled with tension. Derek, a tall white man in his mid-30s, had the kind of presence that made people instinctively avoid eye contact. His uniform was crisp, his movements precise, but his gaze, sharp and calculating, was what truly commanded attention. He had been on his usual patrol, weaving through the busy crowds with ease, his senses alert to every detail. That's when he saw Marcus Wright, a young black man in his 20s, walking quickly down the sidewalk, a coffee cup in his hand. His steps were brisk, his eyes focused on the path ahead, but he wasn't looking at Derek. As they neared each other, Marcus accidentally brushed past Derek, spilling his coffee onto the pavement. The liquid splattered, the scent of hot coffee mixing with the sharp stench of city exhaust. Marcus immediately apologized, his words coming out rushed, but Derek didn't seem to care. Without a second thought, the officer sneered and barked, "Watch where you're going, boy." His voice dripped with contempt, each syllable punctuated by the weight of superiority. The crowd around them seemed to pause, the tension in the air thickening. Marcus, taken aback by the casual cruelty of the officer's tone, stood frozen for a moment. "Excuse me?" he managed, confusion and anger stirring within him. Derek stepped closer, his frame looming over Marcus. "You heard me," he said, his words deliberate, mocking. "People like you don't know how to act in public." The words hit harder than the coffee spill ever could, a familiar sting of racial prejudice sinking into Marcus's chest. He had heard it before, felt it time and time again, but it didn't make it any easier. His fists clenched at his sides, but he fought to keep his cool. "I'm not wasting my time on this," Marcus muttered, turning to leave. But before he could take a step, Derek's hand shot out, grabbing his arm in a vice-like grip. "You think you can just walk away?" Derek's voice dropped to a low, menacing growl. "I think you need a lesson in respect." Marcus pulled back, his voice steady, but filled with the simmering frustration of years of injustice. "Let go of me," he said firmly. And just like that, the officer's hand tightened, and Marcus felt the cold sting of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists. It wasn't just the arrest, it was the reminder. He was no stranger to this system, to its biases, to the fact that the scales of justice were rarely balanced. This was just another lesson he had been taught since childhood. The trial unfolded with a palpable tension, the air thick with unspoken judgment. Marcus sat at the defendant's table, his posture stiff, eyes locked onto Derek across the room. The officer sat confidently, his smug grin unwavering, like he owned the courtroom itself. His presence was almost suffocating, a man who had always been in control, always had the upper hand. Marcus, in his simple suit, felt like an outsider, but his gaze didn't waver. He had learned to stand his ground, even when the odds were stacked against him. Across from him, the prosecutor, Jack Simmons, a tall man with sharp features, was making his case. The charges were clear: disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. The evidence, however, was far from clear. Video footage of the incident had already contradicted Derek's claims, but the case wasn't about truth, it was about power. Derek's testimony was delivered with chilling confidence, painting Marcus as the aggressor, the troublemaker. His words cut through the courtroom like a blade, but Marcus could sense something in the officer's demeanor that didn't match his words. Derek's eyes flickered, just for a moment, a tiny shift that Marcus caught. It was subtle, but undeniable. The smirk on his face, once assured, now seemed hollow, as if there was something more beneath the surface. That moment of doubt lingered in Marcus's mind, a crack in the officer's unshakable facade. Then, as the prosecutor was wrapping up his closing argument, the door to the courtroom creaked open. A man in a sharp suit strode in, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Marcus recognized him immediately. Inspector James Mitchell. James was a man of integrity, a figure Marcus had once respected. The room fell silent as James approached the bench and leaned in to whisper something to the judge. There was a brief exchange, and then James turned to the prosecutor. "Your Honor, I request a moment of pause before proceeding further," James said, his voice steady, his eyes cold and calculating. The tension in the room escalated. What was happening? Marcus couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The room was plunged into an eerie silence as James Mitchell turned to face Derek, his voice sharp and commanding. "You've made a grave mistake, Officer Hayes," he said, each word deliberate, cutting through the tension like a knife. The shock was palpable, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Derek's smug expression faltered, his skin draining of color. The confident, almost arrogant air he had worn so easily slipped away, replaced by something far more unsettling: fear. Marcus could feel it too. The change in the room was electric, the shift in power so sudden and overwhelming that it left everyone breathless. Derek wasn't just a random officer in a courtroom anymore. James Mitchell, the man standing in front of them all, was his superior, and suddenly the stakes were much higher than anyone had realized. James's next words hit harder than any accusation Marcus could have imagined. "I am Inspector James Mitchell of the Internal Affairs Division," he continued, his voice unwavering. "Officer Hayes is under investigation for misconduct, and the events of the past 24 hours have only confirmed several of our suspicions." The words fell like a hammer, and the room erupted in murmurs of disbelief. Marcus could hardly process what was happening. Derek had been more than just an officer. He was a part of something much bigger, something dangerous. For the first time, Marcus saw the cracks in Derek's polished exterior. His smirk had dissolved into a mixture of fear and defiance, the facade crumbling right before his eyes. James wasn't finished. "I have the full report of the investigation. Derek Hayes has been involved in a series of racial profiling incidents, using his position to target vulnerable individuals," he said, his gaze never leaving Derek. The courtroom descended into chaos. The prosecutor, once so sure of his case, looked pale, shaken by the revelations. Even the defense attorney seemed stunned. But it was Derek's face that told the real story, an expression that was a strange cocktail of defiance and raw fear. His world was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The judge slammed his gavel down, calling for order. "Officer Hayes, you are hereby suspended, pending further investigation into your conduct. This case will be dismissed, and you will be placed under internal review." As the room erupted in chaos, Marcus felt a surge of relief. For once, the system was working in his favor. He glanced at James, who gave him a nod of approval. James had been the one to push for this investigation, and now it was clear why. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but Marcus only had one thought in his mind. For all the injustices he had endured, this moment was a glimmer of hope, a sign that, sometimes, justice could still prevail. As he left the courtroom, Marcus turned to James. "Thank you." James smiled. "It's not over yet, but it's a start." And for Marcus, it was a start he would never forget.